Okay, good morning. We're in page 82 in Sadik Daled 5694, which corresponds to 1148, 1149 in Ayin Beis, which I'm looking at right now. Primarily 1149, which we're going to be referring to now more. So on page 82, what did we learn? To summarize what we've been learning, we're learning about the process of the ayin, that divine energy, the channel between the yesh and yesh breaks into two. And within that, there's the rotzen, the levels of the evolution, the process of how from a state of completely being removed from any relationship, an entity edges closer to the relationship with another. And we're speaking primarily how it is in the nefesh and rotzen. That rotzen is the birth of a desire that is preceded by a state where the nefesh, the soul, whether even on a human level, then something is it, relation, and a rotzen begins to emerge. A rotzen begins to emerge, and that is what he called the first level of rotzen kloli. In that, it breaks into three steps: a consideration, heskim, he's basically considering the option, the possibility that this is worthy to be desired, whatever the relationship, whatever the this is, but it's something outside of the nefesh. Then comes a shakavitarya, which he explained is not a rational and intellectual deliberation, which can agree or not agree, or actually completely contradict the initial theory. This is, as we discussed yesterday, a deliberation that solidifies that consideration of the soul to have a relationship with another. What does it do? He says it gives it shape. So Shakavatari here is less of an issue of debating the issue and is it true or not, is it a right or not, but it's the emergence of the general shape of whatever it is that the desired object is about, this relationship. That's the words he used. It gives shape to whatever that consideration was. And that's concluded in the third step in hachlot, a determination, where now you have a solidified rotzen kloli. That's the stage one. It's determined, it's not just a consideration, it's gotten shape, but not shape as in the details of what will be done. In other words, the actual materials needed, let's say in building a home, what will the home be made of, how many rooms, but you have now a clear desire for it, but it's not yet an active pursuit, and it's definitely not, and it's also not in the details of the actual desire objective. But it is achlot, and he says the hechlot is different than the heskim. The achlot is different than the heskim. The first step in the first level is all about the soul's inclination, moving from a state of complete being removed and not relating to considering a relationship. Like he says those words. Heskim is yachas el nefesh, v'lo el dover hamuskim. So the heskim relates to the nefesh, to the one that is considering this relationship, and not to the thing, not to the object of no, it's not the object of the desire, but the one that's desiring. And the achlotim is yacheses el dover hamuskim. And the determination, which is the end of the rotzen kloli, that relates to the dover hamuskim, to the thing that he's considering. as opposed to the one that's considering. I use the words, one is to the Gavra and one is to the Chefts. I mean, one of the examples I've used often is the chief of staff type of thing, which is all he's interested in is what does the Melech, what does his boss want? It's not he doesn't relate to getting it done because that he passes on to he delegates that. The Achlota relates more to the Davar HaMuskim, but not in enough detailed way to actualize a active desire. Then comes the next step. He says, Aval, Hurotzen Kloli Adayin, doesn't have a Tsuda. So it doesn't have the Tsuda. What he means is that it's still a Tsuda Klolis. It has a Tsuda compared to the Heskim, which was only the consideration of the Nefesh. It has some shape and form because now you're determined to have a home, let's say. It's not just you considered the possibility of a relationship. But now comes the next level. And this is built, he says, the Yesod, the Chemer and the Yesod, meaning the matter, the very ingredients and substance. And Yesod, the foundation of the next Ratzon Prati and the Ratzon HaKodem are all born in the Ratzon Klali. Said that several times, previous page and now here twice in this page. That this becomes the Yesod l'Ratzon Prati, the Chemer. Why? Because what details are you dealing with in the second level of Ratzon? The details of what was determined in the first level of Ratzon. In other words, let's use home. You've now come to Achlota. First you considered a relationship, now you've come to the determination that you want a home. That's it, stops there. Now comes, without that, you don't have the next step. The next step now is, okay, you want a home? Now, whether it takes time or not, it could take years, but now we're going to figure out how to build this home. What does it consist of? So you start discussing how large will this home be? What's the purpose of it? How many rooms? What will it be made of? So he's saying these details, he says, is the Yesod and Chemer of that is all originated in the stages of the Shakavitaria and the Achlota in stage one. Because there, you were starting to give it some shape in order to come to a determination. Yes, I want a home. So the wanting of a home, even though you don't yet have how many rooms in the home will be, is the basis for the discussion about the rooms, because it's based on the determination you absolutely want a home. But a home requires a structure and details. So that comes step two, and that is called the Ratzon Prati. Okay. And that, he says, from the Muhus of the Mitzias, of this Ratzon Prati, which is the details, as well as the Hatoya V'Amshacha, being drawn to it, from that will be created, will be crafted, the Ratzon HaKodem. The Ratzon HaKodem, he doesn't spell out exactly what it is here, but it means it's the desire right before it comes into a revealed full state. I'm going to explain in a moment, is that Shir Atzmei B'Keyach L'mayla. Why he doesn't say in the Mosh, not the Dugma Lamata, what the Ratzon HaKodem is, I'm not sure. But because he's relying that once we learn it afterwards, we'll understand. I explained that it's the difference between the how, the what, and the how. That the Ratzon Prati talks about the what. What do you want? What kind of home do you want? And the Ratzon HaKodem is the how, meaning what resources will you need, because you're now ready to go begin. Because if you only have the Ratzon Prati, the second level, let's say the artist, is not just he has determination to make art, but he also has now defined what type of art. You still now need to know how to do it. You need to have a canvas, you need to have paint, you need to how much paint, how much. So in other words, you need that final step that everything is ready to go, and now you're ready to begin building or drawing or whatever the intended desire is. So there's all three levels in Ratzon. Now he's going to go and bring it back to what it is l'mayla in Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. So, if anybody has any questions before I continue, I'll be happy to hear. If not, I'll just continue reading now. Good. Good. Okay, so we're in the middle of page 82. Let me just say something about Mehusa Metzias. Now reading it again, and now that we have, I could say now we have finished the subject, more or less. Still half a page to really finish it, but I will just say the following. It's very clear when you read the 3 pages, from the beginning of chapter 18. So he says a few expressions. I'm going to refer to them and just give you my understanding of how this evolves. When he first begins with Heskim, the bottom of page 80, he says these words. It's a yerida, meaning it's already a descent and being outgoing, leaving the etzem hanefesh. That's the words he used. Yerida legaba atzmus hanefesh. Because in its muhus atzmus, the soul does not have any relationship with anything. But he says, nevertheless, these words, a line that he will repeat and explain in this, it's not 3 pages, basically from the bottom of 80 to the middle of 82. You don't have a mitzias dover. What does that mean? Now we understand what it means. Because nothing came from this. All this was the inclination of the soul considering a relationship. You don't even have a determination. You don't have a shape and form in it. So he says you can't call it a mitzias dover. Mitzir mefuret b'mehus mitziyuse. He says that clear. Mitzir mefuret. Now we understand what those words mean because he used that again now on page 82. What's a tzir mefuret? The tzir mefuret is what emerges in the shakavatari, in the deliberation, and in the determination, clearly stated on page 82. You don't yet have that in the Heskim. So what do you have in the Heskim, in the consideration? You have the shift, and it's focused completely on the nefesh. It has nothing to do, it's not primarily focused on it. It's not about what you're desiring. It's not about the relationship. It's considering, are you open to even talk about a relationship? Is there a sinus mokim? Like I said, someone comes, let's say, with a proposal to a businessman. And the businessman says, I'm not taking proposals. I'm not even open to it. So obviously, nothing else is going to happen then. If you come back and he says, I am now ready to consider it, that doesn't mean I'm committed, but I'm ready to consider a tremendous shift has happened. But you can't say there's a mitzias dover. Like someone will say, you know what? He's going to sign the contract. No, he may not sign the contract. He may consider and then say no. That's a possibility, which we'll talk about in a moment in the difference of the shakavatari of seichel or not. But the point is that you cannot say that a consideration is a mitzias dover because it's just the shift. It's stage 1. Will it become a mitzias dover? We know it's going to become, but it's not there yet. So therefore, he says it's not a tzir mefuret b'mehus mitziyuse. But then he says the lashon be'ein ze elo mashen nesava mitzias mehuse belvad. What is it then? It's only the nesava, the emergence and the coming into being of the mitzias and mehus. Mehusa mitzias, because there's no mitzias. So it's not a ratzon prati, which is where it becomes a mehusa mitzias, that it's drawn to it and there are details. What happens is the beginning of the emergence, and you have to say that's the pshat here, of the mitzias mehuse belvad. So he says, and even though you already have this consideration, so he goes on to speak that it's only it's only a consideration whether it's worthy to consider, whether it's worthy to desire. Then he goes on, in the middle of the page, the second time he uses this, he says, which he already negated at the bottom of page 80. He says, even mitzias mohus, you don't really have yet. What means yet? Because at this stage, it's only a consideration. It's only about the nefesh shift. So how do you explain this? The answer is very straightforward. This is the beginning of the process, that once you have the consideration, then the deliberation and the determination, now you're going to have a tzir mefuret, I should say not tzir mefuret, a tzir kloli. Like he says, the language is very precise. Klolis haprati, Yeah. So essentially, you could say the following. So then, when he says on the top, the next page, on top of page 82, he says, "Ein ela ke'ein gram b'davar sheyeh mitzias b'hu shel haheskem." So you see clearly, this is where he really drives the point home. It's only a gram. It's only a cause, because without the consideration, you're definitely not going to have deliberation and determination. So what is the role of the heskem? Number one is the shift of the nefesh. The nefesh is considering now relationship. And two, I'm saying number two, but it's the same idea, is it's causing the mitzias of the muhus, of the consideration. So the heskem itself, eine dover adayin. That's what he says. La'atzmei, on its own, if you were to separate the consideration from the next two steps of deliberation, it's not a dover adayin. That's why it's called machshav. So why do we call it the beginning of the Ratzon Klali? So he said the reason is because we want to find some way to describe mitzias muhuse. What does this mean? Because at the end of the day, the heskem is the beginning of the mitzias of the muhus. It's the gram. It just, you can't call it mitzias yet until you have the other two. So some type of in-between state from the soul's shift till it actually becomes a shaped, at least in general terms, of a desire and with the deliberation and determination. But it's definitely not mahus mitziuse, because that is the next stage. Okay, this is, as I said, just wanted to finish that point because that was something that was left hanging. What does he mean, and so on. So yesterday I was trying to say maybe he's talking about a different level of mitzias, but I think not. I think he's talking about everything, the same thing, that there's mitzias mahus, which is the whole Ratzon Klali, and mahus mitzias is the Ratzon Prati. The Ratzon Prati as is being drawn to the object, and the details are starting to, and the details were being worked out. Okay.
But the achlota is connected to the mitzius hamahus, right?
You asked that yesterday, and I told you again. There's a Ratzon Klali that has three steps in it. One is a consideration, the second is a deliberation, and the third is a determination. And all three are necessary to create a mitzias hamahus.
But could we divide these three, that the heskem is still further from the mitzius hamahus, because there's no mitzius there at all.
But so that's why I like to stick to the actual language in the Maimer. He doesn't use the language you just said. He uses a different language. Read it. He uses gram bedover sheyeh mitzias hamahus. Then he says that we're trying to describe its mitzias muhusei. So that's why we call it hascholas Ratzon Klali. It's very clear that he's saying is the beginning of the mitzias of muhus. Is it the full form of it? No, because until you don't have the achlota, you don't have it. But you need all three. Read the top lines of 82. It's clear. He spells it out. So no, heskem alone. He says heskem la'atzmei ein a dover adayim. So no, it's not a muhus. The heskem alone. If you ask me, is the consideration mitzias muhus? The answer is no. But you cannot stop the sentence there because it's the beginning. Remember, the consideration is going to lead into a shakavitai that is going to turn into a mitzias of a muhus. That's why when you look back on the page, bottom of page 80, you need to deal with that line. He says, "Mashenasava mitzias muhuse bolvat." He says that on the heskem. So the only way you can explain it is that he's talking about the Ratzon Klali, and we haven't yet broken it down into details. So if you dissect it literally, heskem is the beginning of moving toward a mitzias of muhus. That's the way I would phrase it.
Ke'ein gram, not even a gram.
Okay, fine. Yeah, correct. Because on its own, it's still only, remember, there's a reason for this emphasis. This isn't mechanics. The reason is because he wants to create a level, define a level, I should say, that reflects as much as possible the mokir. Remember, he keeps saying that's misyachas el hanefesh, not el hadover. Not el hanefesh, not the dover hamuskim. Very important point, because the Heskem's role is essentially the nefesh's shift. Basically, that's what Heskem means. The nefesh is shifting toward looking at the possibility of a relationship. So he wants the focus to be on the nefesh, but on the nefesh shifting already. So it's beginning to look at the relationship, but the focus is on the nefesh. That's the role of the Heskem. Then this is supposed to move to a relationship. You don't want it to stay there. So think about don't just think the technical where the level of Heskem is. There's a procession here, a progression, I should say. Okay. Now all this is a dugma. This was all an example in the nefesh ha'adam and the rotzen. Like we said, there's a point in your life when the desire, the consideration begins to emerge. So now he's going to explain this is the way the Eibishter chose to create existence. That it all began in a level that was beyond relationship, completely no shaykhs. Like we looked at Eir Atzmi. He's actually going to go back soon to the language in Ayin Beis, but not yet. He's going to give another introduction, another elaboration. But where he's going now is going to say whatever we just learned all applies to the way Hashem, the way God relates to existence. It begins beyond relationship. That's critical, because we know that Eibishter is beyond existence. He's nothing in common with us. So it begins from there. The way the Eibishter made it was these progressive steps. That first there's an Eir Atzmi, and then there's an Eir HaMispashet that extends, and then there's a level that the Rotzen is not there yet. Kedem Aleisha Rotzen. Then starts a Heskem, consideration. Then goes a deliberation. Then goes a determination. And then goes a Rotzen Proti. And then a Rotzen HaKodem, all the way till the last step before the Tzimtzum. And then the Tzimtzum is already the actual creation process. So these are all steps within God's, if you want, divine consciousness, stages as he moves closer toward the relationship with existence. And again, you could ask, what does God need all these steps for? Because those steps are vital for us to have the relationship with him. So this way we can relate not just to how he relates to us, but also to how he began. I want to have a relationship with you, we say to Hashem, and he wants us, not just when you began to think about us, even before you considered us, meaning before conceptually, even on the levels that you don't have a relationship with us, we also want to have a relationship with you, basically, is what we're saying. However, obviously the relationship has a different form and shape when God is relates. Like I've mentioned many times, when you bench on food, or you give any other birchas hanenin, every morning birchas hashachar, you thank God for giving you life and health and awareness and vision and all the brachas we say. What are we? There we're relating to God as he relates to us. I'm thanking you for giving me the life. I appreciate it. I ate a meal. Thank you. I take a piece of food in my mouth. I say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam. Shachal Nibedvarei, or whatever, by Priya Eitz, by Minimizenus, etc., etc. Why? Because there you're dealing with God as he's relating to us. You need food. He's created us. He sustains us. But a relationship with Hashem we want is much more than just how God relates to us. We want to go deeper into God's consciousness, if you wish, to the point even of levels that he's not even considering a relationship with us. Now, obviously, this needs to be explained because it's not in time, but it is levels because you want a relationship with me on my terms, not because I'm giving you food and sustenance. Okay, you need to pay a price for that. You have to shed your layers. You have to have more bittul. You have to be able to relate to God on that level. And that's why we learn about this. We learn about it because we now can understand, you know what? My relationship with Hashem, he's not my partner. There are levels in godliness that are far beyond me. As soon as you make that statement, and I don't mean just words, as soon as you're aware of that, you're already having a relationship with it because you're respecting its grandeur. You're respecting its mystery. So relationship doesn't always mean that it has to be logical and I have to contain or own it. A relationship could also mean if I respect and honor something that's beyond me, that's a relationship. because you are now respecting what it is. It's not a relationship in the sense that you can say it's on my terms. It's on God's terms, but that doesn't make it less of a connection. So this is vital in the whole process. And I've said it a number of times, because without that, you just ask a very simple klutz kasha. What God has to consider and then deliberate and then determine and then break it into details and drawn to it and shir atzmei and then allocate resources. What is that? Human beings need to do that. But the way Hashem created us, as we're going to learn now, is in the image of God, divine image, because he wants us to relate to him on all levels, not just the things that we can say, oh, we're equals. Okay, that's why I mentioned marriage. As much as you love your spouse, there are mysteries you're never going to get. I'm sure everybody can testify to that. And that doesn't weaken the relationship. It actually strengthens it. You know why? Because it's the truth. If you were to say, I have a relationship with someone and I know everything about her or him, there's not one little thing I don't know, and there's no mystique, there's no mystery, there's no awe. I know everything. It's like I know my hand. Yes, so the relationship is like your hand, as much as you can relate to. But since a human being has all kinds of mysteries and elements that even they may not even be aware of. So how do you have a relationship with something you don't understand? Since when does a relationship dependent on logic? As long as you care about the other person, as long as you respect and you recognize there are things I will never necessarily understand about you, or even if I understand it, I'll never get you. You know, I don't know how you process things. Men and women process things very differently. And it's very healthy that way. A man is not supposed to be a woman is not supposed to be a man. So there's much in common, yes. And there are many levels where you could communicate and you could relate to and you could partner. And you see, healthy relationships build families, solve problems. It's not like two distant entities that have no connection. There's plenty of things in common, but there's also some things that are not. And that's also part of the relationship. And there's it's exactly what you want. Same thing with Hashem. Mamala Kalalman is relating to God as God relates to us. Chachma, Bina, Das, Eir, and Keli. Yes, God is still higher than we are, but at least we have a common denominator. We have Chachma, God has Chachma. Mahu Chanun, Afata Chanun. Just as God is compassionate, you be compassionate. Mahu Rachum. Chanun is more, how do you translate Chanun? Rachum is more compassionate. Chanun is, what's the word for Chanun? Whatever. So in other words, we have something where we meet. Like a chavrusa. You're learning Torah, it says Hashem comes and learns with you. Whatever you learn on your level, relative to your level. Then there's Shevav Kalam, whereas God is beyond us, not completely beyond, like we learned before about Makif with Rotzen. That's now Rotzen. Now you're dealing with God's will and desire. So he's no longer, you're not an equal standing, like I said, like Chanun and Chesed and Gvura and Chochmah and Bina and Das and so on. Now it's beyond. But as we learned, even in Rotzen, there are levels. Why? Because it comes through the Pnimi. So Pnimi is Mamala Kalam, a relationship that's more commensurate. Seva Kalam is a relationship that we're starting to recognize that God is beyond, but it's a beyond that's relating to us. And then come stages that is beyond being beyond, altogether not in our realm. Now, obviously, you want to go from the bottom up because you can't jump to number 3 without number 1 and 2. But that does not mean that when you reach the higher level and you realize that God is beyond Seviv Kalaman even, beyond Rotzen, what we're learning. In other words, there's a levels prior to desire, and there's stages in the whole process. You realize that does not mean that you don't have a relationship. It means now your relationship is with dimensions that are beyond you. That's what it really means. Like I said about Moshe Rabbeinu the other day, you'll see my face when you don't look. There are things you see when you look, and there are things you see when you don't look. On the contrary, you'll get me more when you're not looking than when you do look. Now this, for us, initially, human beings don't like to hear that because we want to own it. You want to say, can I put God on my shelf, that I can own him, look at him whenever I want, on my terms? Well, you know what? That's essentially the root of Avodah Zarah. You want a God on your terms, a God you could see. Like that's where the Rambam explains, that's where it all began. They weren't looking to replace God, they were looking to relate to God. I can't see God, so you know what? The stars in heaven are God's creations. They are God's instruments. I can relate to them. Then the Rambam continues, that's also too far. So they created things on earth, objects or whatever it may be, that relate to each star. And then they built industries around that. At some point, they forgot about God, and now you're like worshiping the instruments. It's like someone worshiping a hammer and a screwdriver instead of the one who uses the hammer and the screwdriver. So that basically is saying God created us in the divine image, and we want to create God in the human image. That's all the problems that people create. They want a God that's like me. Well, you want a real relationship with God, it has to be a God like him, not like you're like, you are looking to be part of him, not you're looking at him to become part of you. But that doesn't mean you don't have the stages on the lower levels. That's why we have Avodah. It says a person should always serve God, do Torah mitzvahs, shalei l'shma. What does shalei l'shma mean? For some ulterior motive. I'll become more refined, I'll become wealthier, I'll have schar, I'll be schar gashmi, schar ruchni, some motive. I'll look better. The Torah says that that's the way, the order. Why do you begin with that? Because that's how we were wired. We're subjective people. It's very hard that Rambam Paskins, the end of Hilchos Tshuva, that no person except Avram Avinu was able to serve God. He says, Eisa se'emes mepnei shu emes. That was Avram Oyavi. Avram, my beloved. That Avram did truth because it was true. Everybody else, there's another reason. It's a pretty strong statement. Why? So the Rebbe explains, Chassidus explains, because the Eibishter wants God, he wants you to have God on your terms first, before you have God on God's terms. But teich shalei l'shma, like the Rebbe teaches, b'teich, the inner, the pnimius of leil l'shma, you're going to come to l'shma and serve God for God, like he says in Pirkei Avos. What's the lashon there? Shalei almanas l'kabel pras, or almanas shalei m'kabel pras. That a person is right in the beginning of Pirkei Avos. Now these are levels, higher and higher levels, but there's nothing wrong to begin. On the contrary, le'elam yasik adam. You tell a child, you do well at school, you learn Torah, you'll do a mitzvah, we'll give you a candy, we'll give you a toy. That's not wrong. That's the way it's supposed to be, because that's the terms the child relates to. You get older, you realize the toy, the candy, the whatever it is, the new clothing, whatever it is a keli, a lavush for something much deeper. As the Rebbe explains in a very powerful sikha about when you take the einfirnish, when you bring children to school the first time, you wrap them in a talis, you throw candies, and you say it's from Malach Michal. Famous story of the Frierdiker Rebbe that before Pesach, they were cleaning out his pockets and they find the candies, chometz. So his mother, someone asked him, "Where was that? Why you have candies in your pocket?" He says, "Because when they took me to Cheder, said Malach Michal threw the candies, and I didn't want to eat them. Malach Michal is very precious." So the Rebbe asked a question. We all know it's not Malach Michal who's throwing the candies; it's the parents, or the teacher. The child will grow older and say, "What second? You lied to me. Chinuch is built on a lie. It wasn't Malach Michal. You threw me the candies." I remember as children, we always had this issue on Pesach. They had the kos of Eliyahu. Eliyahu comes in, supposed to sip from the cup. So, my family, uncles, all the adults would shake the table. So we thought that Eliyahu drank from the cup. It didn't take long to find out that that was not necessarily the case. So the Rebbe asked the question, what's this thing with the candies? The Rebbe's answer is mamish this teichen. I'm bringing it down on a very practical level. The Rebbe says, no, the sweetness in the candies, where does it come from? It comes from Malach Michal. It's Ruchni, is the source, is Chesed of Asiyah, Chesed of Yitzirah, Chesed of Bria, or Malach Michal. Malach Michal manifests in these candies. A child doesn't understand yet what a malach is, so you can't talk to them about spirituality. So you talk to them and say, here are the candies. This is like the lavush, like the moshel of the gashmi that's really carrying within it malach machol. As he gets older, he comes to realize, 1 second, there are higher levels of sweetness. There's physical sweetness in a candy. There's also spiritual sweetness in learning, spiritual sweetness in connecting to godliness, etc., etc. My point is that we begin always on terms that we relate to. Then you grow, and then you realize, 1 second, God is beyond me, and even beyond. And that essentially is what we're discussing, those higher levels of beyond, before the tzimtzum, before there was any creation. So I just wanted to bring it back a little. This is this heavy and abstract. Sometimes you need to come back and say, okay, what's the point of all of this? I mean, it's good. We can definitely, there's definitely, what's going to say, exercises your brain muscles and your mind, because you got to figure out what level. But at the end of the day, that's what's going on here. It's a relationship with the levels that are beyond relationship in God. And I think we all understand what I mean by that. Okay, I keep. Now let's actually learn inside. How about that? So he says, middle of page 82, the line that begins, Asher memuhus mitziyuse nasa ratzon hakodem. Haratzon hakodem. So the Frierdiker Rebbe continues. This is still the language of the Frierdiker Rebbe before we get back to the Ayin Beis. Asher adugma mezel lamayla. So it's like everything we just learned. The dugma from this that we just learned, lamayla. What is it a dugma for? What's going on above? What's above? Who be say this klali? This is a dugma to teach us and explain to us about the dugma zelamayla who be say this klali in the general awakening, if you wish, or stimulation or inspiration. Say this literally means awakening, to waken up, to stimulate, to arouse. The general say this klali kavyachol. Of course, it's kavyachol, because by God, it's not about you have to wake him up or stimulate him, but it's about how it arises. But atzmusi is barach kameishu lifnei atzimtzum. Atzmus is baruch here doesn't mean atzmus that we've been talking about built in Metzias Nimtza. He means in the core essence of the divine consciousness, or even higher than consciousness, before the tzimtzum. As we learned, before the tzimtzum, everything is really all within the divine. Relative to after the tzimtzum, it's complete pshittus, completely shapeless. But nevertheless, we are told and revealed to us what's happening so-called under the dashboard or behind the curtain, before the tzimtzum. So he says everything we learn now is a dugma lamaila. In this, the dugma of this lamaila is beisedus klali. So it's interesting. He uses beisedus klali. He doesn't mean to negate prati. He means to say in the overall way that God starts relating to existence, and he's going to give an overview of this dugma. The imayes. So before we get to what, he's not beginning right away with comparing. So where are these three levels lifnei tzimtzum? That's going to come lower bottom of page. He's going to give now a type of overview of this whole, how we are a dugma to what's going on above. So he says, v'imayes ashenasa odem b'tzalmenu kidmusenu. Even though a person was created it literally means our image and likeness. So it's talking about the creation of the human being, the divine image, right? The beginning of Bereshis, the story of creation of the human. The Adam Shalamata, that the human below, who bedugmas tselem Adam Elyon. See the word dugma. He's an example of and an image of. Like a type of copy, like a carbon copy or a type of copy, tselem, of Adam Elyon. Adam Elyon is meaning the supernal man, meaning the structure of Adam in the higher worlds, essentially the 10 spheres. Uksiv, and it says, Umipsari echza laka, for my flesh I behold God. It's a very strong statement. And it means that our very flesh allows us to behold godliness. Like he continues, the Adam, this means that the Adam, hine mebinyan gufe, from the structure of his body, v'halichas nafshe ruche v'nishmose. And the halichis is an interesting word here. Halichis means the journeys, but I think halichis means also their way of processing, their movements. In other words, how the soul functions, basically. Halichis is more functionality, even though the word halichis usually means the way they travel, but halichis means also halichas in terms of their methodology, their functionality, their approach, their characteristics.
Like hiluch hanefesh.
Right, hiluch hanefesh, exactly. Hiluch hanefesh means, like when someone will say to you, what are you inclining to? So that's not your physical body structure. That's like where your nefesh leans to, its inclinations, its even the soul's complexion is a good word, or composition. It's a lot of words. Halicha is a very broad word, but basically is saying that from a human being, the body structure and the nefesh's personality. It's a loose translation, but that's okay. Of nefesh, ruach, and neshama, not just one level. He's saying all three levels: nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Yochel lahaskil. So again, from the binyan gufe, from the mepsari. What does mepsari echza lekam mean? And that we were created b'tselem elikim. It means that from the structure of the body to the personality, or to the characteristics of the soul, yochel lahaskil ulahavin, we can conceive and understand the seid sfiris upartsufim ha'elyenim. The seid means secret, but secret also means beseid, meaning the inner dimensions of the spheres and partsufim alyenim, the supernal, the higher spheres and partsufim. Remember, I explained the sphera is an individual characteristic, and a partsuf is a composite, like a structure. So he's saying both. We can understand the spheres and their structures above. The eris pnimim, eris makifim. Both in the eris pnimim, which means the internal and immanent energies, and in the transcendent and removed energies. Specifically, let me spell that out. We learned what that is. Eris pnimim is, the keiches pnimim is chachma through malchus, and makifim is rotzen and tainug. He said that explicitly back on page 55, bottom of 55. But that's a common meaning of it. So bottom line, to sum up what he just said, remember it's all im hayes. Where he's going with this, we'll find out. He's saying now, in other words, the human being below, created in the divine image, for my flesh I behold God, which means my physical body structure and my soul's personality and characteristics. From that we can understand, we can conceive and understand the spheres of patsufim alyenim, the higher spheres and structures, both in eris makif, eris pnimim, but eris pnimim, eris makifim. Not sure why he doesn't say eris makifim, which seems to be the right way to say it. Maybe there's a reason, I'm not sure. Maybe it's supposed to be read be'eris pnimim kama eris makifim. Anyway, just pointing it out. But kol mokim, now he's going back. Ima yes. Now it seems to be that he's qualifying. He says, why do we need to have, well, maybe not. No, let me not say that. So he's saying, Ima yes, that the human being, in all its in all the body and soul, teaches us about the spheres and patsufim, makol mokim. This is the end of the sentence, the phrase. Nemar echza elaka. The expression of the pasuk is echza. Veloy nemar era. because echza is in Aramaic, chizoyin, and the zriya. So echza and era are really synonymous.
Echza is not Aramaic. It's a different expression. There is a chizoy.
I think somewhere it says that's also, maybe the Rebbe says it. Maybe right. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Possible. Okay. But bottom line is he uses the word echza, which also means to grasp, and not era. I see. So the Friedrich Rebbe is going to explain why. Shehu riya pnimis museges umorgeshes mamish b'riya chushis. When you say era, one second. Yeah. When you say era, he's saying it's a much stronger and much more intimate type of seeing something. He calls it ria pnimis, meaning you're really not just seeing superficially. It's an inner being, museges, that's understood, umurgesesh mamish. It's comprehended and literally palpable, palpably felt. B'riya chushis. In a riya chushis, like you're actually seeing something directly, not in any concealed way. He'll soon compare this to echza. Right now it's era. He's going to prove what that means. How do we know? Al derech diksiv, like it says, similar to what it says, shalosh pamim b'shana yira. 3 times a year, this is the mitzvah of shalosh regalim. What does that mean? 3 times a year, it says, you shall make an aliyah l'regel. You shall go to Yerushalayim. You should see, to come see. It's going to say, to see and be seen. To see the Beis HaMikdash, to see the Shechina. It's essentially a sign of deep respect. You're coming to see godliness in the Beis HaMikdash. So it says, V'amar Razal, and Rabbeinu Zal say, in Chagiga Dav Beis Amar Aleph, right, the beginning of Chagiga, Kederech shebal ireis, kach bal ireis. Just as you're coming to see, you're also come to be seen. In other words, it's a two-way thing. You're not just coming to see the Beis HaMikdash and the Shechina, you're coming also to be seen by the Eibishter there. So he explains, what does this mean? The Beis HaMikdash in the Holy Temple, Ro elakuz b'muchesh. They actually tangibly and palpably saw godliness. Lefisha bebeis hamikdash heir elakuz begili ba'avov ksavis gashmin. Why? Because in the Beis HaMikdash was not just a building. Remember, it says v'asili migdash v'shachanti b'seicham. It's a building in which v'shachanti, God dwells, resides among you. Basically, in the physical world, that he says the Vav Ksav is Gashmim, the 6 sides. Mokim is made up of 6 different sides, right? East, west, north, south, and top and bottom. When you look at anything 3-dimensional, it's 6 sides. 2-dimensional is 4 sides. There's the left side, the right side, the top here, but there's no 3rd dimension. So the 3rd dimension adds. That's why on Sukkot, the Nanuyim is the 6 directions. So he says, in the Beis HaMikdash, Elokus was radiated in a revealed way in the 6 dimensions, the 6 sides of physical universe. It wasn't just a spiritual thing. It came down to the physical reality. V'chein b'chol inyanim tivim, hativim. And this affected, it wasn't just in space, it also was in all physical or natural matters. Like he says, V'hainu, what does that mean? Shemizbatel chumriyosam v'yanira, that during the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the inyanim tivim, which means natural things, that we, for example, the sun rising, the sun setting, the trees, the birds, everything in nature. So he says, during the time of the Beis HaMikdash, mizbatel chumriyosam, their coarseness, which means they're like their identities as they are physical coarse beings, was nullified. And it was seen and obvious in the Yesh HaNivra, in the created yesh of this world, amitis muhuse, its true personality, shahu elakus. That is divine. In other words, they saw the divinity, they saw godliness even in nature. And then he goes further. And space and beyond space were as one. Ukamaimer. You think he's going to bring mokim arneina min amida, right? Doesn't. He brings, because that was in the Kodesh Kadosh. He wants to say that we experienced it too. People experienced it. So he says, Ukamaimer. Eim dim tzvufim umishtachim im revochim. They stood tight. They were like crushed, like sardines. Tzvufim means they're very tight with each other. But when they came to be mishtachava, when they needed to prostrate themselves, they had all the space. How's that possible? Standing, they couldn't even move. And suddenly, when they're mishtachavim, when they're bowing, there was space. So the vachim means it was plenty. It was expansive. How's that possible? So you have to say that mokim and bli mokim were like one. I know it's interesting. It's not. It seems like he's digressing a bit, but he's coming to explain Echza versus Era. So this all explains, this is true Riyah. Now, why does he give this example? Because everyone saw this. You saw packed Yerushalayim, the packed courtyard, wherever they were, the Ezra Yisrael, in the Beis HaMikdash, many people. You think you can't move. Suddenly it comes to the time to bow. When the name of the Eibishter was mentioned, or whenever it was, or different times there. So then, suddenly, mishtachvim revachim. So they saw with their own eyes a paradox. I once heard a vort. I'm not saying it's negate to hear, but it's a nice vort. It says, "Eimdim tzvufim." That when you stand upright, meaning your whole ego is in place and your whole, it's me, then everybody's clashes with each other. When you're mishtachava, when you have bittul, and you demonstrate that it's not about you, you're bowing down, then suddenly there's room for everybody. A nice word. Again, it's not what he says here necessarily. Here he says it as a miracle, but it's interesting word. This is all
good.
Era.
Very good.
Yeah. It's similar. The Rebbe once asked the question. It says when Yaakov came by Yetzi Yaakov meBeer Sheva, so the pasuk says he lay down there to rest, and it says Vayikach Avan, and Rashi brings what happened. He took Avonim, and he surrounded himself to protect himself. But then the lashon the pasuk says Evan, one stone. So Rashi, so the Chazal ask what happened. He says because the stones all argued. They all wanted to be under the head, like the pillow of the tzaddik. So all the stones wanted that schus. So a miracle happened that they all became one. So therefore there was no argument. So the Rebbe once asked, so why didn't they argue which part of this one stone should be under his head? It's still, he can't have his head on all parts of the stone. So the Rebbe answered, and maybe there's a source, I don't remember. The Rebbe said, they only argue when they're separate stones. Once they become one, your good is my good. So that wherever he's lying, they all feel they're part of it. Similar, what of when you have bittul, then there's no problem with someone else, because not an else, it's part of you. Shein Navot, ne?
Yeah.
Okay, this is all Riyah. This is all when you use the word to see.
You mentioned that same thing. Why did they argue about? They were only a stone. What did they want? Yaakov should put his head on a stone. So they said, don't worry for the Rebbe. They were worried for themselves. They want to be under him.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, all this is about Riyah, to see with the word Era, Riyah. Avol Chezoyin, now he's going back to the word Echza. Remember, the pasuk says, Mepsari Echza Elaka. Avol Chezoyin, when you use the word Chezoyin, which is also a word for vision. Hu ria nelemes. This is a concealed form of vision and sight. U'kamoy chizayin laila, like a night vision, like a dream. So yes, it's still called chizayin. You are seeing something, but it's vague. It's not clear. It's more of a dreamlike state, as opposed to, like you said, ria muchshis. You actually see something. Here, it's more of a somewhat in a cloud, like more of a Ukanal. So why is the word echza used? Because as we learned earlier, the kol efen hasagasenu, the entire method of how we understand things about godliness, obviously, about ruchnis, hu yediyas hametzias belvad. We only know it exists, but we don't know it's muhus. So that's why he called chizayin. When a Novi, especially Moshe Rabbeinu, sees Elokus, he sees it with his own eyes. As we see physicality. In the physical, we see Ria Mukhshis, but the spiritual, the Ruchni, we know. So it's a form of seeing, but it's more like Chacham Ein of Bereshe. It's more like your mind sees, but not necessarily your eyes literally relate to it as they did in the Beis Hamikdash. So it's called more of a chazayin. Mipsari echza laka means from my flesh, I can surmise in a certain way, I can get a somewhat of a vision of godliness. That's what he says here. Umakol mokim. Even though we only have Yediyas HaMetzias Bilvad, we only know it exists, we don't have an intimate understanding of its personality like Yediyah Pnimius, Ria Pnimius that he said before. Nevertheless, a surmising, I don't want to use estimation, I think it's more to be surmised, to get a sense. The klolos inyan, the general idea, musaglanu, that is understood. That we do understand. V'hu move kloli, and that's a general introduction, or like pathway, passageway. Move is like when you write in the beginning of a book, you write a move, an introduction. It's like a passageway into the actual experience. So it's a move kloli, it's a general introduction, la'inyonim ha'atzmim, to core, essential matters. K'moy shehem, the way they are, adreim ha'mailas, all the way to the highest of levels, b'madreges the Erein Sof shalifnei hatzimtzum, in the levels of Erein Sof before the tzimtzum. So this is the Frierdiker Rebbe's introduction to what now is going to go back to the Rebbe Rashab 3 levels in the Heskim. The Ratzon Klali. For Heskim, he's going to talk about Heskim, Shakvataria, and Hachlot, and then the other 2 Ritzenis, Ratzon Prati and Ratzon HaKadosh. We'll stop here. So this was the long introduction. So he says like this, Ima Yes. That's the Ima Yes. He says, this dogma that we learned about Ratzon, how it works with the Nefesh, helps us understand what's going on in the highest levels. Even though a human being was created in the divine image, and it's only echzeh, it's not a sharp, direct perception like it is with Riyah, but still it gives us a hashara. We do get a sense of what's happening. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is actually qualifying and explaining what it is we can understand from our own beings, of Ratzon and everything, how it functions in the physical body and in the nefesh, the ruach neshama of a person. So it's a two elements here. On one hand, yes, it's a limited, it's not like clear vision, but to say that nothing is there is also not true. You get a hashara. So we could essentially get a sense and get a picture. You get a picture of what's going on up there. That's a good word here, picture. Not quite seeing it firsthand, like we see face to face, like we saw during the Beis Hamikdash, Riyah, but a picture, an image, somewhat of a depiction we can have. We can depict what's going on. And with this, he's going to go back now and say, okay, so what is going on? Lifnei hatzimtzum, based on this. It's a very interesting, a lot to talk about this piece we just learned, which again, Frierdiker Rebbe is adding, but it adds a lot of depth because you realize, okay, if you jump from us to Lifnei Tzimtzum, you start saying, 1 second, we're just suddenly, I've talked about this many times, we're suddenly able to understand Lifnei Tzimtzum. But this gives somewhat of a clearer way of understanding how we relate to it. Not direct, but at least we're getting some part of a picture, an image to depict the events up there, Lifnei Tzimtzum.
That's what Chassidus does, gives us that gotcha.
Snapshot, in a way. Okay, so we'll stop here, bottom of page 82.